In the pale light of a Montana morning, a trembling shadow appeared on an old wooden porch. Something small, wild, and crying. And beside it, a house cat who had buried her own kittens only weeks before. How those two lives collided. You probably won't believe what happened at the end of this story. It unfolds in the foothills outside Libby, Montana, in a place where the forest presses close and animals wander through backyards like drifting spirits of the wild. So before you get into this unbelievable story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like the story I'm telling. Part 1. The Lost Mother. The nights had grown strangely quiet in the small cedar cabin at the edge of Libby, Montana. For years, Mara, the gray tabby who ruled the porch steps like a gentle queen, had filled those nights with soft purrs and the rustling sounds of her kittens nursing. But after the fever swept through her litter earlier that spring, the cabin had fallen silent. Mara no longer slept in her woven willow nest by the fireplace. Instead, she curled in the darkest corner of the mudroom, where the scent of her lost kittens lingered faintly in the wood grain. She barely ate. Sometimes Eleanor, her owner, would find Mara sitting on the windowsill long before dawn, her tail wrapped tight around her body, staring toward the forest as if waiting for something that would never return. Eleanor tried everything: fresh fish broth, warm blankets, gentle strokes along Mara's spine. But Mara's body stayed tense, her eyes dull with a quiet, unspoken grief. The little cat moved through the house like a mother searching for paws she could no longer hear. And as the spring deepened into summer, the forest outside grew louder, greener, richer with life. Yet inside the cabin, Mara's world remained gray. On a morning in late June, before the sun had fully climbed over the fir trees, a thin, broken sound drifted across the porch. It wasn't the chirp of a bird or the squeak of a squirrel. It was sharp or fragile, like a plea scraped raw by fear. Mara's ears snapped forward. She lifted her head, alert for the first time in weeks. Another sound followed, a tiny mule, swallowed by the wind. Mara leapt down from the windowsill. The screen door creaked as Eleanor stepped out moments later. The porch boards were cool with morning dew, and the pine air felt clear, washed clean by the night's light rain. Eleanor saw Mara frozen at the edge of the steps, her body low tail flicking in shock, and then she saw what Mara saw. A tiny bobcat kitten no bigger than the length of a boot lay trembling beside an overturned flower pot. Its spotted coat was patchy with mud, one ear folded, its ribs sharp as reeds beneath its fur. The kitten tried to stand, paws slipping, and collapsed again with a weak cry. In that instant, something older than memory moved through Mara. Her whiskers angled forward, and she stepped closer, not cautiously as a cat should when facing a wild animal, but with the deliberate softness of a mother approaching a frightened newborn. The bobcat kitten lifted its head, blinking through the blur of exhaustion. And when Mara touched her nose to its forehead, the small creature didn't shrink away. It leaned in, pressing its face into her chest fur, as if it had known her all along. Eleanor's breath caught. She could see the decision forming inside Mara, the way her spine straightened, the gentle rumble beginning in her throat. The tabby wrapped herself around the wild kitten with a protectiveness that startled even her owner. Mara wasn't just comforting it. She was claiming it. Something in that kitten's desperate trembling filled the hollow space inside her. A space she had believed would remain empty forever. But a question flickered between Eleanor's thoughts as she watched the two animals together. Where had this tiny creature come from? And was something or someone out there searching for it in the depths of the forest? The kitten's behavior offered few clues. It kept trying to bury its face into Mara's fur, hunting for warmth, for safety. When Mara began to groom it with slow, rhythmic strokes, the bobcat's cries softened into small, exhausted whimpers. The forest edge remained still, no larger shadow lurking. No call of a mother bobcat echoing through the trees. Only silence. An uneasy silence, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Eleanor gently wrapped the kitten in a soft kitchen towel and carried both animals inside. Mara pressed so closely against her that her paws nearly tangled beneath her. Every time Eleanor tried to move the kitten to examine it, Mara circled back, placing one paw protectively across its back. That protectiveness only deepened over the next hours. The kitten slept in Mara's nest beside the fireplace. Mara curled around it, shielding it from drafts, licking its head when it twitched in its sleep. She even tried nudging it toward the empty space where her own kittens had once nursed. And when the kitten cried for food, Mara paced anxiously around Eleanor, tail puffed with urgency, guiding her toward the warmed milk Eleanor had prepared. As the day stretched toward evening, something shifted inside Mara. Her tail began to sway again, lightly brushing the floor. Her ears no longer drooped. When the kitten whimpered, she responded instantly, touching her nose to its side, reassuring it. Her movements grew steadier, almost purposeful, as if she had found a reason to breathe again. Yet beneath that fragile bubble of peace, an unspoken question tugged at the corners of Mara's world. A tension neither she nor Eleanor could name. What would happen when the kitten grew strong enough to stand? And what else might be waiting beyond the tree line of the forest? For now, though, Mara kept the kitten close, unaware that this small spotted bundle of life would one day return to her porch with something so unexpected it would change everything. Part 2, The Wild Sun Returns. The seasons changed around the cedar cabin in slow, patient layers. Summer's heavy heat giving way to the crisp bite of fall. Then, to the long white hush of a Montana winter. Inside the home, something else changed as well. The tiny spotted kitten who had once fit in the crook of Eleanor's palm grew into a powerful young bobcat with shoulders that rolled like small waves beneath his thickening coat and paws large enough to leave half-moon imprints in the snow. Eleanor named him Hollow after the empty flower pot where they'd found him. But Mara never called him anything. The house cat greeted him every morning with a soft bump of her forehead against his chest, as if names weren't needed between them. Hollow's size quickly dwarfed her, yet he moved around Mara with an unexpected gentleness, sidestepping her food bowl, lowering his head when she groomed the fur along his cheek, even rolling onto his side in a gesture that should have been impossible for an animal born with predator's instincts. But the wildness inside him was growing too. Hollow began slipping out after dusk, his long tail disappearing between the spruce trees at the back of the yard. At first, he always returned before dawn, brushing against Mara's flank before curling beside her to sleep. But by midwinter, he stayed away longer, days than entire weeks. Eleanor understood it before Mara did. The forest was calling him. No bobcat, not even one rescued by grief-stricken house cats and kind-hearted humans, could resist the pull of the wild forever. Mara felt the change before she could name it. When Hollow's absences stretched longer, she began pacing along the porch rail, ears tilted toward the hush of the trees. She would stop eating for hours at a time, sitting instead with her nose pressed to the gap, under the door, waiting for the scent she knew too well. Eleanor tried comforting her, but Mara's restlessness was a language of its own. One evening, after nearly a month without a sign of Hollow, the wind carried a different smell across the yard, one that made Mara freeze in place. A mixture of pine sap and cold metal. A scent of travel-hard soil and something unsettled. Her tail bristled. She stepped to the far end of the porch, eyes narrowed toward the tree line. A shadow emerged, broad-shouldered, heavier than before, and moving with a strange, jerky hesitation. Hollow. He stopped at the edge of the yard, sniffing the air, his breath visible in the dying light. His eyes, once wide and kitten-soft, held something new now. Something tense, as though he carried the forest's secrets behind them. Mara sprinted to him, her paws barely touching the ground. But Hollow didn't lower his head this time. He didn't nuzzle her back or roll onto his side. Instead, he paced in a tight circle around the yard muscles quivering under his coat. His whiskers flicked backward. His tail lashed once, twice. Something was wrong. Eleanor stepped out slowly, careful not to startle him. Hollow froze at her scent, but he didn't retreat. He stared at her with an intensity that made the back of her neck prickle. It was as if he wanted to communicate something urgent, yet couldn't. Mara approached him again, more cautiously this time. Hollow let out a low, throaty rumble, not a growl, but a sound filled with uncertainty. He walked toward the porch, then back toward the woods. Back to the porch, back to the woods. A thought wavered through Eleanor's mind, like a question carried on the wind. Was he torn between two worlds now? Mara circled him, touching her forehead softly to his shoulder. This time he let her, but only briefly. He pulled away, pacing again. His ears pinned back. His claws flexed against the frozen ground. Something had happened out there, something Hollow didn't know how to carry alone. When he finally settled enough to lie down, Eleanor saw its small scratches across his flank, the kind left from brambles or narrow escapes. But there was no scent of another adult bobcat on him, no trace of a territorial fight. Instead, Hollow smelled of damp earth, river water, and something faintly different, something younger. Hollow lifted his head and looked at Mara with a mixture of longing and confusion, an emotion so raw it struck Eleanor silent. The bobcat was no longer the starving orphan rescued on their porch. He was a predator now, shaped by instinct and wilderness. Yet in Mara's presence, something softer flickered through him, as though the forest hadn't torn away everything he'd learned under her care. A gust of wind rattled the porch rail. Hollow flinched, then stood again abruptly. Without warning, he padded back into the woods. Not a retreat, more like a decision. Mara followed halfway down the steps before stopping, her body trembling with the recognition of a coming change. Something in Hollow's eyes, when he looked back one last time, left a question heavy in her chest. What burden was he carrying out there alone? And would the forest take him from her for good? Or bring him back with something she could never have imagined? The answer would arrive far sooner than any of them expected. Part 3. The new babies at her door. 2 nights after Hollow's uneasy return, the wind shifted again over the yard. A storm had swept down from the Cabinet Mountains, dragging a cold drizzle behind it that soaked into the earth and left the air heavy with the smell of wet pine. Mara lingered by the window, her paws pressed into the sill as she watched the tree line vanish and reappear behind sheets of rain. She had barely slept since Hollow's visit. Something in his eyes, something restless, almost pleading, had etched itself into her thoughts. Eleanor found her there before dawn, still staring. The woman set down a mug of coffee and knelt beside the cat, stroking the ridge of Mara's back. "He'll come back, sweetheart. He always does." But even Eleanor's voice carried a strain of doubt. Hollow wasn't a house pet. He was a creature of the wild, and the wild had been whispering something to him. By sunrise, the storm had passed, leaving a mist that clung low to the ground. Mara jumped from the windowsill and trotted to the front door, tail low movements taut with expectation. Eleanor opened it for her, the cold air spilling into the cabin like a breath held too long. Mara stepped onto the porch and froze. At the far end of the yard stood Hollow. But he was not alone. Two tiny shapes wobbled beside him, each no larger than a mitten, their coats a soft blur of brown and downy spots. Bobcat kittens, even smaller than Hollow had been when Mara found him. One stumbled on a slick patch of grass and let out a thin cry. Hollow immediately nudged it upright with his nose, a gesture that was as careful as it was desperate. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Mara moved first. She bounded down the porch steps, her paws splashing through the wet grass. Hollow stiffened muscles tight under his coat, but he didn't back away. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his tail held low, his eyes fixed on Mara as though waiting for a judgment only she could give. The kittens shivered in a trembling heap between his front paws. Their whiskers quivered. Their fur was soaked. Hunger and exhaustion clung to them like shadows. Hollow let out a soft, guttural sound, a sound that carried none of the confidence of age or instinct. It was a fragile, uncertain note. A request. In that moment, Eleanor understood. Hollow hadn't found them by accident. He had brought them here, for Mara. The house cat approached slowly, nose twitching as she inhaled the scent of the two abandoned little bodies. Their cries grew louder as she came near the smaller of the two, pawing weakly at her leg. Mara lowered her head, touched her forehead to each of theirs, and began to groom one with slow, deliberate strokes. Hollow exhaled a breath that trembled like something inside him had been held too tightly. He circled once as if unsure where he fit in this new fragile constellation. But Mara stepped forward and brushed her cheek against his jaw. Hollow froze, then leaned into the touch. Only for a second. But it was enough. The gesture told him what he needed to know, that the burden he carried was seen and accepted. Eleanor gathered blankets, warming them near the fire, and returned to the porch with a box lined in soft towels. Mara guided the kittens inside, curling her body around them as though she had rehearsed the motion in her sleep. Hollow followed close behind, ears pricked for danger, eyes scanning the yard as if the forest might reclaim what he had brought here. As Eleanor watched, a realization settled slowly. Gently, Hollow was not the father of these kittens. He was barely more than a juvenile himself. But something in him, some instinct shaped by Mara's care, had recognized their helplessness. He had found them in the wild alone, and instead of walking away, he had brought them here, to the only mother he had ever known. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled softly. Mara licked the kittens clean, pressing them to her warmth. Their breathing steadied. Their cries softened. For the first time in months, she curled into her willow nest without the hollow ache of loss tightening around her. Hollow sat nearby, watching her. His ears twitched at every sound, every shift of the kittens, every click of the cooling stove. At one point, he lowered himself onto the rug paws tucked beside him and let his eyes close. Not in sleep, in relief. Eleanor approached him quietly. "You did good, boy," she whispered.
"You did good, boy."
Hollow blinked eyes, following Mara as she guided the kittens deeper into their nest. A quiet question flickered through him, something old and instinctive. Was this home or sanctuary, or something in between? He didn't know,
Good boy.
but for now he stayed. Outside the forest, waited. But inside, for the first time, Hollow allowed himself to lean into the warmth of the cabin's air. Not as a guest, and not as a creature torn between two worlds, But as a son returning with a plea for help, for guidance, for the future of two tiny lives, he refused to abandon. And in the fragile stillness of that morning, Mara answered that plea with the simplest gesture of all. She wrapped her tail around the new babies and purred. Hollow watched her, and something inside him settled at last. In the quiet days that followed, the cabin seemed to breathe with a new kind of warmth. Mara moved with a steadiness she hadn't shown since the loss of her own kittens, her steps soft and sure as she tended to the tiny bobcat sleeping in her nest. Hollow lingered near the doorway or the warm hearth, watching over them with a strange mix of vigilance and peace. And through it all, Eleanor found herself slowing down, speaking more gently, letting the rhythm of this unlikely family steady her own heart. Life has a way of circling back, of stitching torn places together with threads we never expect. And as those two orphaned babies purred against Mara's side, it was impossible not to wonder if any of us were faced with such a choice between walking away or opening our hearts again. What would we do?
Thank you for listening to the whole story. Tell me what you think by comment below.